Hey everyone, Speeder Ice here, and I'd like to give you guys an in-depth look at the Back to the Future card game. Now this card game, it was pretty hard for me to find. It's put out by Looney Labs, which isn't the largest company in the world, so you can't really find it at like Walmart or Target or anything like that. You really have to go to a game store to find it. So on their website, they actually have a distributor list, and you can use that to try to find the game. But if you've played one of their previous games, Chrononauts, which I haven't, I've heard that it runs a lot like that. But if this is your first time with a Looney Labs game, or with a card game that's not Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh or one of those types like myself, this is going to be a useful look at how this game works. So let's take a look at the timeline. Now I've arranged the cards that make up the main game in their timeline. Basically this is going to be your playground for the entire game. I'm going to run the camera over the cards slowly so that way you can look at them. As you can see, they're in chronological order by the movies. And you'll notice that some are different colors, and I'll explain that in a minute. This is the 50s timeline. But basically, all of these cards have two sides to them. This side that's up right now is the side that is up when the game begins. And it's basically the timeline that the movies follow if all of the events occurred as they were supposed to, without Doc Brown's time machine. Now, to show you what this mechanic is like, let's go through the events of Back to the Future Part 1. In Back to the Future Part 1, we start off in 1985, and Marty goes back in time to the 50s, and the first thing that he does is he gets his father, through some way or another, to confront Biff. Now, by flipping this card over, we'll see that that's now the card shows that George McFly has punched Biff, and it says to flip over card C1. It corresponds with card C1. C1 is right here. Instead of George McFly getting a job at a place where Biff Tannen is his boss, now George McFly gets a short story published. He has the confidence, and he begins to publish short stories. Now, at another point in the movie, George McFly will kiss Lorraine. But let's say Marty fails in that mission. Let's say that they don't kiss. Well, if they don't kiss, that's this side of the card. That linchpin will cause a ripple in time that corresponds with B6 and C3. B6 is this card, where Lorraine and George McFly become parents. Well, if they don't kiss, they don't fall in love, and Marty McFly and his siblings are history. So let's flip this over. Now what's occurred? Lorraine and Biff actually went on a date because George and Lorraine did not kiss. Now, that also will affect card C3, which is Lorraine and George McFly's 15th wedding anniversary. Well, if they don't kiss, they don't fall in love, and they don't have a wedding anniversary. So we're going to flip this card over as well. She marries Biff. Third time's a charm. So now you can see that our timeline is already screwed up based on a couple of card flips that we've done. We've flipped the linchpin cards, which are the purple cards, and they affect the blue cards, which are the ripples that are marked on the linchpin. So we've kind of dabbled in the 50s. If you remember the movies, Marty then goes back and actually saves Doc by writing him a letter that he will be murdered by terrorists. So if Marty changes this event, and Doc Brown is almost killed, but saved due to his bulletproof vest, then Doc Brown will still be alive, so he can travel back in time to the Old West as we know happens in the third movie. Now, in the second movie, it also goes into the future. In the future, Doc Brown tries to bring Marty back so that way he can pose as Marty McFly Jr. and say no to Griff. Remember the scene where he's saying, Cafe 80s, guy named Griff, just say no. So, let's say Doc Brown succeeds. Marty McFly poses as Marty McFly Jr. and says no. That will change events at D4 and D6. D4 is the youth jailed. If you remember, the USA Today showed that as a headline. Well, because Marty McFly Jr. said no, and there was that whole hoverboard sequence, now the gang was jailed instead of the youth. D6 is this card. Now, this is when Marty McFly's daughter, Marlene, tries to break her brother out of prison. Now, this card can't be flipped unless two cards are flipped. The Marty McFly says no, and also Marty's injured in a car crash. So this event will still occur, even though only the gang is jailed. Same with Marty being fired. Marty will still be fired in that Facts with Needles, unless he learns to stop overreacting when people call him chicken. So it works. The game works like that. They use critical events in the movie, and the corresponding ripples in time will be flipped. Now, the most dramatic card that will affect the entire timeline is this one right here. This is what happens in the second movie when Biff gives his younger self the sports almanac. If you remember in the movie, that created an alternate 1985, and that's exactly what happens here. Because Biff gives the almanac to his younger self, instead of just turning 21 and losing all his money at the racetrack, Biff wins big at the races. Because Biff won big at the races, he has enough power and influence to murder George McFly and get away with it. He also marries Lorraine. Instead of opening an auto detailing business, he opens a casino. And Doc Brown, instead of being commended, is actually committed. So that one card affects 5 events in this timeline. Now, what does all this mean? Well, while you're playing the game, you're actually one of multiple characters and descendants from different timelines, different alternate timelines in the Back to the Future universe. And all of these characters have goals that they have to set up in the timeline. For example, for Vern Brown to exist, Emmett has to arrive in the Old West, Hill Valley has to host a wedding, and Emmett Brown must be commended. Under the current timeline, Emmett Brown is actually going to be committed, so that way he'll never go back to the Old West, and because his mother, Claire Clayton, has fallen into a ravine, Hill Valley hosts a funeral rather than a wedding. So for Vern to set up the conditions, to set up the timeline in the ways that will allow him to exist, he has to actually get a time machine, flip this card so that Claire Clayton doesn't fall into the ravine. The ravine is still called Shonash Ravine. So we're going to flip this card. So now it's renamed to Eastwood Ravine. And because these two cards are flipped, instead of hosting a funeral, Hill Valley is going to host a wedding. Then Vern is going to have to flip this back over, which will in turn change all of these back to the way they were. Actually, except for this one, because Lorraine and George never kissed on the dance floor, so they never fell in love, and they never got married. But that doesn't matter to Vern's timeline. Vern is not concerned with the McFly family, so that can still be set this way, and Vern can still exist. So Emmett Brown is commended. He arrives in the Old West, and he marries Vern's mother, Clara. So Vern can exist in this timeline. At this point, the goal of the game is to uninvent time travel. Now, we all know, Back to the Future fans, that if you uninvent time travel, you're going to cause a major paradox. And I don't know why this is the end game, but once the timeline is set in your favor, the goal of the game is to get a DeLorean and flip this card, where Emmett Brown invents the flux capacitor. Now, 4 out of the 5 cards, there are 5 identical cards here, 4 out of the 5 of them have mysterious forces prevent you from changing this event at this time. So basically the game keeps going, and other people can alter the timeline. But when you flip a card over and it has the alternate version of this event, then you've won the game. Time travel is uninvented and the timeline is locked. But in Vern's case, he would be erased from existence, because Emmett Brown, if he does not invent time travel, he'll never go back to the Old West, he'll never marry Vern's mother, and basically he'll live out the rest of his life in 1985. So that's the way the timeline system works in Back to the Future, the card game. I hope it made some kind of sense. Check out my other videos to go over the items and action cards and the time vehicle cards for this game. That's it for now. See ya.